morning everyone. In this lecture we will talk about some of the experiments that were done during this project, as experimental archaeology was one of the pillars of this project. But in our papers we generally don't focus on the results, not necessarily on the experiments. So often the experiments don't figure anymore in the final papers, which is sad, I think, because experiments are very interesting and it can be good to see what people have done. As you can see, only Diederik and my name are on the first slide. That's because we put this paper together, but we will be presenting the work of many different people. On every slide, with every experiment, we put one person. And that's not because one person helped or did this experiment. With every experiment there were many people joining, helping out, etc. So the person you see on the slide was the person initiating this experiment. The researcher that came up with the problem is there on the slide. We decided not to put everyone there because it will be a lot of people and also a big risk of forgetting people, especially since so many people were involved. So we decided to do it this way. But I think everybody knows who helped out, that they helped out. When we were looking at the experiments, we saw we could divide them in 3 different kinds of experiments within the project. There were the very large-scale experiments, like the building, the canoe, etc. Then there were some object category-led specific experiments. Because when you're doing research, especially user research and other research, you sometimes come across objects which remain questionable. Artifacts of which you don't know how they were used and you have a theory that needs to be tested. So then an experiment is started. But also some methodological experiments were done during the project, where we look at our methodologies and see what we can improve and how we can improve them. In all experiments, there's always something happening, and that's the unexpected results. I love this about experiments. When you do an experiment, you always learn something that you weren't looking for. You don't only get the conclusion or the answer to your question, but you always learn more. And especially in this project, there was always an exchange of knowledge. As I said, many people worked on every experiment. So there was exchange of knowledge between scientists, craftspeople, volunteers, and everybody else who helped out in the experiments, and we all learned a lot. Every experiment ever done, I think, also adds something to your view of the past. Because as an archaeologist, you have a view of the past. You have an idea what the landscape looked like, what the people did, and how they lived. And when you're doing experiments, you learn some more about this. Often you learn that you're wrong, or your views change. That's also a very important thing of experimental archaeology, because as an archaeologist you paint a picture of the past to other people. You give information for visualizations. The pictures taken during experiments also give this information. So experiments work on in changing our view of the past. Well, the first experiment I'm going to discuss is done by Lasse van den Dickenberg. He did an experiment into recycling Neolithic axes. The axes have come along already before in many of the presentations, which will be the case, by the way, with a lot of the experiments that we will be presenting. Flint is not locally available for the Vlaardingen people, so they get it from 70 to 300 kilometers away. 70 kilometers away is just ordinary flint, but there's flint mines at 300 kilometers away, where they also get the flint. For example, Hesbe, Rijkholt and Spien. As those sources are far away, recycling is an important part of flint technology, especially the axes. The flint axes in the Vlaardingen culture were polished. You can see them in the top pictures. During use they sometimes break. Like the picture in the bottom right, we have one of the experimental axes that broke during use. It just broke off in the haft. But also in the middle you see an archaeological axe that was also broken in 2 pieces. Of course, if you're a Vlaardingen person and your axe breaks, you're left without an axe, which is very sad. But you're also left with 1 or 2 pieces of very high quality flint, because those axes are made of high quality flint. And you can nap those axes into smaller pieces that you can use again. You see some of the pieces on the bottom, and you can see that the polished surface is still present on these flakes, which are generally relatively easy to recognize in your archaeological record, so you know that that flake has been part of an axe. But of course, not all pieces will have this polished outer surface. There's also some pieces that are on the inside of the axe. And how can we recognize them? How can we see how many of those flakes in the side may have been part of an axe? That's why Lasse set up an experiment in which he used 4 axes. 1 axe was already previously used during another experiment and broke, so it were 2 pieces, and 3 axes were especially made for the experiment. 1 was kept whole, and the other was napped into prior to flaking to imitate the end shock, as you also saw with the broken axe in the experiment. All of those axes were then flaked to produce a variety of flakes. So especially to imitate normal use, like to have all different kinds of flake. This was done at Mazamuda as a public demonstration to also, of course, connect the public to the materials, and all flakes and all debris was collected. Well, if you have ever seen a flint napper at work, you know that's a lot of pieces, bigger pieces, smaller pieces, and a lot of very small pieces. All those smaller pieces, the debris, everything smaller than 1 centimeter, was sorted to size, and then every single piece that was knapped, even the smaller pieces, were analyzed by Lasse and other people who helped them out to see whether they had polished surface. And the results, they were quite surprising, because 59% of the flakes from the eggs did not show any polished surface. Only 41% of the pieces knapped from an egg will be recognizable as an egg fragment, and the rest of them just look like normal flakes. For the smaller flakes, the smaller fragments, the 1 to 4 millimeter fraction, it was even 79% that don't show any polish. This led to the conclusions that the importance of recycling flint eggs on the Neolithic Vlaardingen culture site was greatly underestimated. Previously it was estimated that 10 to 20% of the flakes were originally part of an egg, and it's much higher than that. If we look at Hekelingen, where Lasse found 18% of the flakes to be X-flakes, to have this polished surface, that translates to 44 X-flakes if you count in the invisible ones. In that case, Lasse could also see that some of the flint types, notably the Hesbaye flint, which is also often used for X's, was predominantly imported as flint X's. So the Hesbaye flint was not imported as raw material, but only as X's. Maybe to use as a raw material, but in the shape of an X. Then we move on to the next experiment by Lucy and others, of course, again. This experiment looked into how the food crust in prehistoric pottery actually form. Because over the years, Lucy has analyzed many food crusts from many different cultures in very different places, but it's still unclear exactly how these crusts are formed. We find them, but how they come to be there is still the question. So what we did is we had 3 pots that were made with a shape, temper, clay, baking temperature, etc. that were close to the Vlaardingen material, that were filled with 3 different meals, and we cooked those meals. We cooked them until all the water was evaporated, and when the food crust started to form, Lucy ended the experiment, broke the pots to look at the food crusts. It's a nice and very good setup, and these are the meals that were cooked. The first one is a porridge-like meal of emmer grain and flax seeds, and you can clearly see there's a charred layer of porridge-like material on the edge of the pot. The second meal was made of crushed acorns, crab apples and rose hips, and also here a thick crust accumulated on the side of the pot. There's a very charred layer and then a food crusty layer as well. And in that layer you can also still see the coarsely ground acorns embedded in the residue, as we used coarsely ground acorns for the experiment. The next one was cooking fish, and we cooked the fish Vlaardingen style, which is just chopping the whole fish or just chopped in rough pieces, scales and all, into the pot. And we cooked that with Gelder roast, as Lucy already mentioned earlier today. First of all, if you look at a personal, I was there with the experiment as well, but also the other people there, it looked gruesome. It didn't look like something you would actually want to eat with those scales and fatty, and it looked really horrible. But apparently that's what we find in the pots. And you can also see a very characteristic residue that's accumulated at the rim of the pot, so at the top there and also lower of the scales, and a fatty whitish residue from fish fats. Those were the 3 experiments, and then if we look at the food crust, you can see that the experiment was successful because there were nice food crusts there that really resemble the ones from prehistoric pots. There is, however, a difference. As you can see, the replicated food crusts, they get loose from the pot, so they're not stuck to the pot, but they tend to fall off a little bit. While the prehistoric food crusts are always connected to the pot. The prehistoric food crusts are also cracked, they have a calculate surface, while our experimental food crust didn't have that kind of cracks. This may be that there was a different cooking method, or maybe the food crust came to be in another circumstance than we created, other accidents happening, or, especially related to the cracks, this might also be a taphonomical process. Then another experiment that already came by in the movie was of a digging stick. This digging stick was found in Vlaardingen, and we could look at it in the museum. That's also why these are our own pictures that are not very nice, because this was made in the museum when we were looking at the object with the root group. And it was originally interpreted as a digging stick. But when we looked at the tip of the stick, the traces there didn't look like we know from experimental digging sticks. So, of course, that warranted an experiment. I think this is, by the way, a nice example of one of those object-led specific experiments. One object, one question, and a series of experiments. So 3 digging sticks were made by the Masamuda volunteers, using only stone tools, of course, to make the stick look like the prehistoric one. And they were used to dig, as that was the original hypothesis, to stir in a pot, and to soften fat-tanned deerskin. Here you see the tips of the experimental sticks. And I like this one because you can clearly see the results, the differences. If you look at the digging sticks, you see it's heavily rounded, and that the softer parts of the wood are worn away. So the harder parts are a little bit higher, and the softer parts have worn away a little bit. If you look at the stick that was used for stirring, you can see that the top layer of the wood is worn away. It's lighter, and there's clear scratches visible in the lighter areas. And the last one, the result of toughening skin. You see it looks smoother, it's slightly rounded, and there's a polish starting to form. And this actually looked like the stick that was found in Vlaardingen. So the conclusion, it's a small experiment with, in this case, a very nice and clear conclusion that this stick was probably used to soften skin or to work skin during the tanning process. Then we go back to the flint again, an experiment that Lasse did into the flint scrapers that were found. Many of them were used for height working, and there was a variability in the height working. Because if the height is in a different state, so fresh height, leaves different traces than dry height, then dehairing, etc. So there's many differences in height working traces. And it had been suggested that some of these scrapers might be used on fatty skins. And the problem is if skin is very fatty, it's hard to scrape, because the fat acts as a lubricant, making it hard to scrape the skin. So it was suggested that maybe they added a mineral additive to facilitate the scraping and making it easier. The two seal skins were obtained from the Zeehondencentrum in Pieterburen, because seals have very, very fatty skins. And then first the blubber was removed from those skins. One skin they added dry clay, and to the other one they added sand. And both skins were then scraped with flint scrapers. And then we come first to one of the unexpected, but also sort of expected results, that the cutting blubber, because flint blades were used for cutting blubber for 4 hours, and even after 4 hours of use, there was no use wear on those blades. That is, because I said before, the fat works as a lubricant, and without friction, there's no traces. That also tells us that if they have ever been cutting blubber in prehistory, we will probably never ever find those traces on flint tools, because it just doesn't leave any traces. They also made incisions in the skin to fit it into the frame, and there was polish after 20 minutes. So because the blubber was removed, and you cut through skin and hair a little bit, there was polish there. But of course, what the experiment was after was the traces of the scraping. It created a heavily rounded edge and a band of polish along the edge. Unfortunately, those traces did not resemble any of the traces on the Vlaardingen sites. Also, there was no clear difference to see between the clay and the sand. So clay and sand leave sort of the same traces. But there was an artifact on Schip Leiden that was probably remembered by Annemieke that had the same traces. So going backwards, we could also, from sites analyzed a long time ago, we did find the match for the archaeological traces. This gives us new insight in how this can be done, how those mineral additives help or not help in scraping skins, and whether that was done in prehistory. Annemieke already said that I was going to talk about the bone awls. So that's this one. Again, you see only Annemieke here, but of course the research was done by many people. There was several experiments done. When analyzing the bone tools, they found a lot of plant working traces and a large variety of plant working traces, creating questions about how exactly those tools were used. Therefore, it was decided to also use the SEM to analyze those bone tools, to see whether the SEM could help out with the analysis of those use-wear traces. And because SEM will give another view and another look at the traces than a metallographic microscope, this might help to interpret and maybe distinguish between those traces. This variety of plant working traces was not only seen between the different awls, but also on the same awls. They set up experiments to test their hypothesis. Now, together with Ineke Joosten and Annemieke looked with the SEM at the use-wear, and indeed the view was different. One of the experiments they did was polishing the bone awls with horsetail. Horsetail is known as a polishing agent and also, of course, a material that can be used in craft activities. But in this case, the plant working traces were all over the tool. So not just on the tip, which you expect to be used, but all over the tool. So the suggestion was that maybe the horsetail was used to polish the bone tool during manufacture. And in the experiments they saw, as you can see at the bottom right, you see the traces on the experimental tool, and those traces resemble the traces on the archaeological tool, suggesting this might indeed be a very good option. A second experiment looked at the bone awls. On a lot of the bone awls, traces of grass were found, and they resemble an experiment done by a beehive maker that we have in the lab of a tool that was used for coiling beehives made out of grass. But, and I'm gonna read this out. On many of the awls, we found randomly oriented striation in combination with a bright polish we connect with contact with grass. These traces bore close resemblance to a tool used by present-day craftsmen making beehives by means of the coiling technique. However, thinking about the practicalities of having these very vulnerable tools lying around in a domestic context, we started to consider storage. And what safer storage is there than having a small container filled with grass or wool, which we haven't explored yet, to protect the tips. They are easily accessible, and being stored like that, you can imagine that awls were used for all sorts of plants and skins, which would explain the fact that we see the traces from different contact materials on them as well. There's another one possibility for those awls, especially the one you see here that was found at Hekelingen, that seems to may have been used as a clothespin, because of course a bone awl is also very usable as a clothespin. So an experiment was done where they stuck a bone awl through a fabric made out of wetted lime bast to see what kind of traces this left, and of course also the distribution of traces. Because in useware you don't only look at the traces you see, but also the location of these traces. Because you can imagine if you use a bone awl only for piercing, the traces are only up to a certain height on the tool. When it's used as a clothespin, you expect the traces to be more located in the middle, where it's been stuck in the clothes and been moving around a little bit. If it's being used as a needle, or to pierce through material, or there are production traces, you expect the traces all over the surface of the tool. So also the distribution of the traces tells you something about how things may have been used. I'm going to read out a little bit again. Awls have often been considered simple tools, but they can also be used as an accessory like a clothing pin. Its function is not limited to a single use. A clothing pin could also be used as a tool which was ready at hand. To replicate this use, a bone awl was repeatedly stuck into a fabric made out of lime bast. To conclude, it's not strange that every time we looked at awls we saw different traces, which were often difficult to attribute to a specific contact material. These awls probably had a far more complex biography than a simple use on one material. Traces from contact with plants could be related to use, manufacture, storage and transport. And awls could be used in a variety of craft activities, involving materials like hide, bast and of course various plant species. And that also explains how complicated it is to analyze those bone awls. Because the tools, the materials used to polish them and to produce them may have been the same as the materials they were used on. And all those traces will get together. So conclusions from the experiments is that the SEM provides another view of the useware. Polish is less prominent and the surface topography, including striations, are more clear, and SEM therefore provides another view of the traces. I also heard that dirt is very visible, much more visible with the SEM, allowing another interpretation for that. So doing useware with the SEM is promising and still continuing. Final conclusions about this still have to wait. Well, as already said, all show a complex use. They're not one-time objects, they're used over and over again. And not only used, they're also produced and stored with maybe the same materials. So we know that they did a lot of things with the awls, but exactly what and how is not always clear. Then the last experiment for today is useware on querns. It has my name, but I also have to mention in this case Tessel de Nijs, who did all of the experiments as part of his bachelor thesis at Saxion Hogeschool. So even though my name is here, I didn't grind anything. That I think is important to say in this case. This is a more methodological series of experiments, because in archaeology we often find much more lower stones than upper stones, because a quern is of course always two stones together. So it has been suggested that maybe they used wood in combination with stone to grind cereals. That's something we wanted to try out. Of course, there's different cereals ground in different periods, and we wondered whether it's possible to distinguish between those different kinds of cereals. We have looked into this before, but we always use different kinds of stones. Because if you are going to do an experiment, you want to use the stones that the people in the past used. So you go to the sources where they source their stone and you get the stones. But of course, because it's all secondary sources, you can't find exactly the same stone. So you can do two experiments on exactly the same stone. That's why in this experiment we used only one kind of stone, I will show you later. And to see whether it was possible if you use exactly the same kind of stones, if there's a difference between two different kinds of cereals. Also, if you use wood and stone in combination, do you see traces of those stone handheld quern on your useware traces on the stone? We use wooden handheld stones in combination with wooden stationary stones and vice versa. You see a big lower stone there made out of wood at the top, and on the bottom you see the very ugly, I have to say, grinding stones that we used for the experiment. There's a simple reason for this. We wanted to use sandstone, but if you want to use the same stone, you have to get them commercially from somebody who works stones. And in the Netherlands, it's forbidden for stone workers to work sandstone because of the dust getting into your lungs, etc. So we had to use granite. But that's why those stones actually look like headstones for graves or kitchen tops, because that's the kind of stone that we used. But the good thing is, we know it's the same, because they're from the same source, the same block, so we know it's exactly the same stone. We use those to grind barley and wheat to see the difference. We also grind barley in combination with other stones and with wood. And we also involved, well, in the end only one plant material not yet available in a reference collection. Because for useware you need a reference collection, and we have many plant materials there, but people in the past ate so much more than we have tried yet. So these are the experiments done. They are grouped because it's always a lower stone and an upper stone. And you can see that we used granite, different kinds of wood, and everything has been ground. It has also been calculated how much material was processed per hour, so to say. And you see there's quite some differences. These are some photos of the objects and tools used in the experiments, because if you're going to do an experiment like this and you want to grind hazelnuts, you also first have to crack them. So next to those experiments done, there are some extra experiments in cracking hazelnuts, cracking acorns, etc. Here you see some of the traces left. I can imagine if you've never done use-wear analysis, they may look all the same. But if you're a use-wear specialist, you can see that those traces are clearly different from each other. The top left one is actually the yellow water lily, the other plant we involved in the experiments. And that's very different from the other ones that look more the same. Those are hazelnuts, barley and acorns. Unfortunately, the first conclusion is that we are not able to distinguish between traces of wheat and barley. So even using the same stone, having a long-run experiment, it's not possible to distinguish between them. So we will always just be stuck with cereals. And the wooden querns, we've tried different combination with wooden handheld, wooden lowers, etc. And for most materials it didn't really work very well. For example, I think it was the barley that was only flattened and not actually ground with the woodens. Only acorns. For acorns they work better than the stone tools with stone and stone combination, but for the other materials wood doesn't seem to be an option. And also a very good conclusion for us was that if you have different kinds of stones for your experiments, the traces don't vary that much. So we continue the way we are doing experiments with different kinds of stones and reliably using them to interpret the archaeological material. Those were the experiments that I wanted to present to you. Thank you for your attention, of course, but also a special thanks to everybody who helped out with the experiments, because as I said before, there are many others than were visible in this presentation. And a special thanks to the volunteers at Mazamuda and the students at Leiden University and Saxion, who also helped out with many of the experiments.